Yeah, was actually I was thinking what he would give up after my hard punches. Why he didn't give up? He come when I dropped him, he come up again. Respect for the guy, but I win. You know, I still undefeated.
It's too hot here, but doesn't matter. Like people talking before the fight inside the arena, it's gonna be hot. It's gonna be it's like whatever they say, I say, hey, it's gonna be not only for me, it's gonna be for my opponent too. If he can fight, I can fight all night too. You know, I don't worry about this. But right now, I want a little bit enjoy. Please.
When Khamzat Chimaev first entered the UFC, the reaction was immediate. Fast finishes, constant pressure, and a level of dominance that made him feel different from almost everyone else in the division. For many fans, the conversation quickly became about hype. Could he become champion? Was he the next global star? How far could he go? But while most people focused on the excitement surrounding his rise, Khabib Nurmagomedov appeared to look at the situation differently. His comments about Chimaev were never overly dramatic. He didn't present himself as predicting the future, and he didn't dismiss Chimaev's abilities. Instead, his perspective seemed more measured, more focused on long-term realities rather than short-term momentum. At the time, those comments didn't receive the same level of attention as Chimaev's performances themselves. The focus remained on finishes, rankings, and growing popularity. But over time, some fans began revisiting what Khabib had said. Not because everything changed overnight, but because certain patterns started becoming more noticeable. From an analytical standpoint, this is where the discussion becomes interesting, because the question isn't whether Khamzat Chimaev is talented. That part is already established. The real question is whether Khabib identified something deeper, something related to sustainability, expectations, or the long-term demands of staying at the top level of MMA. And if he did, why did so many people overlook it in the beginning? To understand that, it's important to go back to the start of Chimaev's rise and the environment that surrounded it. The rise of Khamzat Chimaev happened faster than almost anyone expected. From the moment he entered the UFC, the reaction was immediate. His performances weren't just victories, they were dominant, fast-paced displays that created the impression of a fighter operating at a different level. In several of his early appearances, opponents struggled to establish any control at all. Chimaev pressured constantly, closed distance quickly, and dictated where the fight took place. Whether through grappling exchanges or aggressive striking, the pattern remained consistent. Once momentum shifted in his favor, it became difficult for opponents to recover. From a stylistic standpoint, his approach felt overwhelming. He combined physical pressure with confidence and urgency, creating the perception that he wasn't simply trying to win rounds, he was trying to break opponents mentally and physically from the opening moments. And because many of these performances ended quickly, the hype surrounding him accelerated rapidly. Fans began discussing title fights almost immediately. Analysts debated how his style would translate against elite competition. Some even questioned whether there was anyone in the division capable of matching his intensity. At that stage, momentum was entirely on his side. But rapid rises in MMA often create a specific environment. Expectations increase, public attention expands, and every performance begins carrying more weight than the last. From an analytical perspective, this is where long-term evaluation becomes important. Early dominance can reveal a fighter's strengths, but it doesn't always answer questions about sustainability, adaptation, or how that style holds up under evolving circumstances. And while much of the MO world focused on Chimaev's immediate success, Khabib's perspective appeared to focus on those longer-term variables instead. While much of the MO world focused on the dominance and momentum surrounding Khamzat Chimaev, Khabib Nurmagomedov seemed to approach the conversation from a different angle. His comments about Chimaev were generally respectful. He acknowledged the talent, the physicality, and the level of pressure Chimaev brought into fights. But at the same time, there was a noticeable level of caution in how he evaluated him. From an analytical standpoint, that distinction matters, because Khabib's perspective was shaped by long-term experience at the highest level of the sport, not just by individual performances. Rather than focusing only on finishes or hype, he appeared more interested in questions related to consistency, discipline, and sustainability. Can a fighter maintain that pace over time? Can they manage expectations as attention increases? Can they adapt once opponents begin preparing specifically for their style? These are the types of questions that often determine longevity in MMA, and historically, Khabib placed significant value on structure and discipline, not just talent alone. This is part of why his assessment stood out. He didn't seem convinced by momentum by itself. Instead, he appeared to evaluate Chimaev through the lens of what happens after the rise, once pressure increases and competition adjusts. At the time, that perspective didn't attract as much attention. The excitement around Chimaev's performances was simply too strong, and most discussions centered around potential rather than limitations. But over time, some of Khabib's observations began to feel more relevant, not necessarily because Chimaev failed, but because the conversation around him started becoming more complex than it initially appeared. And that complexity is what shifted the narrative. At the height of Khamzat Chimaev's rise, the momentum around him was difficult to challenge. His performances were explosive, the finishes were immediate, and the public response was overwhelmingly positive. In that kind of environment, caution tends to receive less attention than excitement. From an analytical perspective, this is a common pattern in combat sports. When a fighter appears dominant early, discussions often become centered around potential rather than long-term evaluation. Questions about sustainability, discipline, or adaptation are pushed aside because the immediate results feel more important. That's part of why Khabib Nurmagomedov's perspective didn't resonate with everyone at the time. He wasn't rejecting the hype completely. He was simply approaching it with more restraint. But restraint rarely spreads as quickly as excitement. Fans were focused on what Chimaev could become. Media coverage amplified the momentum, and every dominant performance reinforced the perception that his rise would continue without major resistance. In that environment, measured analysis can appear less compelling, especially when compared to highlight finishes and growing popularity. There was also another factor. Many people viewed Khabib's comments through the lens of comparison. Because both fighters shared similarities in terms of regional background, grappling influence, and aggressive pressure-based styles, discussions often shifted toward whether Chimaev could follow the same path Khabib once did. That comparison increased expectations even further, but it also created assumptions. Some fans interpreted Chimaev's early success as proof that the long-term outcome was already predictable. And from a broader perspective, that may have been the main reason Khabib's cautionary tone was overlooked. Not because people disagreed with him completely, but because the hype surrounding Chimaev was simply louder. As Khamzat Chimaev continued facing higher-level competition, the conversation around him gradually became more balanced. The dominance was still visible, the pressure was still effective, and the talent remained undeniable. But for the first time, there were moments that introduced new questions. From an analytical standpoint, this shift wasn't necessarily about losses or dramatic decline. It was about visibility into areas of his game that hadn't been fully tested during his early rise. Longer fights began revealing different dynamics. Opponents showed more resistance, pacing became more important, and the ability to maintain control over extended periods became a greater factor. This is where some of the concerns Khabib appeared to emphasize started becoming more relevant. Not because Chimaev suddenly became ineffective, but because the sport itself adjusted around him. In MMA, early dominance often creates a strong first impression, but once fighters accumulate enough footage, opponents begin preparing differently, defensive strategies improve, timing becomes more refined, and stylistic counters start emerging. That process affects every elite fighter eventually, and in Chimaev's case, it shifted public perception from certainty to evaluation. Discussions became more nuanced. Instead of asking whether he could become champion, people began debating how his style would evolve against increasingly disciplined competition. There were also growing conversations around preparation, weight management, and consistency, all factors that become increasingly important at the top level of the sport. From a broader perspective, this didn't invalidate the hype around him, but it did make the situation more complicated than it originally seemed. And as those complexities became more visible, Khabib's earlier perspective started to feel less like caution and more like experience speaking ahead of the moment. As time went on, the public conversation around Khamzat Chimaev began to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually the discussion became less focused on invincibility and more focused on uncertainty. From an analytical perspective, this is a natural transition that many fast-rising fighters eventually experience. Early hype is usually built around dominance and projection. But over time, audiences begin looking for consistency, adaptability, and proof against increasingly difficult opposition. And once those expectations rise, every performance is examined differently. In Chimaev's case, the perception shift wasn't driven by a single moment. It came from accumulation. Competitive fights, questions about pacing, conversations around preparation and weight management, and the realization that elite-level MMA becomes significantly more complex once opponents have time to study and prepare. As these discussions increased, more people started revisiting comments previously made by Khabib Nurmagomedov, not because Khabib had predicted failure, but because his perspective seemed grounded in realities that only became obvious later. He appeared to understand that talent alone doesn't guarantee long-term dominance. At the highest level, sustainability matters just as much as explosiveness. Discipline matters. Adaptation matters, consistency matters, and from a broader standpoint, that may have been the core of what he was trying to communicate from the beginning. This shift in perception also changed the way people evaluated Chimaev's future. The conversation moved away from certainty and toward possibility. Could he still become champion? Absolutely. But now, the path looked more demanding than many originally believed. And that difference changed the entire narrative around him. Looking back at the discussion surrounding Khabib Nurmagomedov and Khamzat Chimaev, the most important point is not whether Khabib predicted the future, it's how he evaluated the situation from the beginning. While much of the MMA world focused on excitement and momentum, Khabib appeared to focus on the long-term realities that eventually challenge every elite fighter. Pressure, expectations, adaptation, consistency. From an analytical perspective, those factors often matter more than early dominance alone, and that's what makes his comments feel more relevant now than they did at the time. Not because Chimaev failed to live up to expectations, but because the conversation around him evolved into something more realistic and more complex. At this stage, Chimaev is still one of the most dangerous fighters in the sport. His pressure, physicality, and finishing ability continue to make him a legitimate threat against anyone in the division. That hasn't changed. What has changed is the way people view the path ahead. The assumption that dominance would automatically continue without resistance no longer feels guaranteed. And in many ways, that shift reflects the exact kind of perspective Khabib seemed to have from the start. A perspective built not on hype, but on experience. Because fighters who spend years at the top level often understand something that audiences sometimes overlook: talent gets attention, but sustainability defines legacy. And as Chimaev's career continues to develop, that balance between explosiveness and long-term consistency may ultimately determine how far he can actually go. Which is why, looking back now, Khabib's words carry a very different weight than they once did.